Attention all parents seeking to break the chains of conformity in education. Welcome to Paradox, where your child's mind is liberated, nurtured, and empowered to thrive in today's complex world. I'm Will Roosh, an educator with nearly 20 years of experience, fiercely compassionate about fostering viewpoint diversity and critical thinking. If you're tired of the cookie cutter approach to education and yearn for a platform that embraces individuality, you're in the right place. Picture this, your child no longer confined to the limitations of traditional education, but instead flourishing in an environment that encourages curiosity, questions the status quo, and celebrates diverse perspectives. With Paradox, your child will embark on a transformative journey guided by live teaching, Zoom workshops, personalized support, and a curriculum designed to challenge, inspire, and ignite their intellectual curiosity. Say goodbye to the one-size-fits-all approach and hello to the world of limitless possibilities. Join me at Paradox and let's empower your child to think critically, embrace diversity, and become the architects of their own future. Go to paradox.com to learn more.
Hello and welcome to the next episode of Cylinder Radio. I'm your host, Will Roosh. I'm back at it. I took a couple of months off, but I'm back, baby. and I'm here to address a whole bunch of different controversial issues from various viewpoints. I was talking to a friend of mine who said, why is it called cylinder radio? The reason is because if you look at a cylinder from one angle, it's just a circle. You look at it from another angle, it's just a rectangle, but it's actually a 3D complex shape. So and take any idea and you can look at the complexities of it. And my guest today is someone that understands the idea of complexity. And there's a couple of different areas where he's an expert that we're going to be able to touch on. So Jason Bassler is the co-founder of the Free Thought Project, focused on exposing government corruption. He's also the founder of Policing the Police, which is about police misconduct. And Matt Taibbi, who I talk about all the time, I love Matt Taibbi, called him one of the most extensive records of law enforcement misconduct and misbehavior in America. That's quite high praise coming from who I would say is pretty much hands down one of the best journalists that we have going today. But Jason is also an author for a children's book called Know Your Rights, which is extremely important in like my area of civics and stuff like that, but also wrote a book on central bank digital currency, which is something that I know very little about, but I want to dive into more. So there's a lot of angles we can go on this podcast. Jason, so thank you so much for being here. You're in this world of like conspiracy theory. Is that like what we would call it? Is that like the way it kind of gets like, stigmatized and stuff like that, but it's all backed up with research and data, and it ends up being true. You're just like a little ahead of the curve, so you get called like these kind of names and stuff like that. I mean, how would you describe kind of what you do and kind of who you are, and then please like also bring in like how you even got here, because it's off the beaten path.
Sure. Yeah, it absolutely is. And hey, thanks for mentioning my Know Your Rights book as well. We just launched that not too long ago. So yeah, we're excited to have a physical book out to share with the people. But Will, thanks so much for having me on, brother. I've been looking forward to this since you were on our podcast last year. Yeah. So, and I just wanted to say, thank you. You're always advocating the value of nuance, and I very much appreciate that. So thank you, brother. But I'll just keep it quick as far as like my own, origin story or whatever. I'm a long time activist, anarchist, journalist. I was involved with some activism in my youth, but I was really inspired by the 2011 Occupy Wall Street movement. That's what kind of got me activated, if you will. Yeah. And basically when I was watching that online, and that was one of the first times this stuff was like really on YouTube and really, really prevalent online, I realized that it just wasn't the version of America that I knew or I had learned about. And so that kind of put a fire in me, and it kind of, as I said, activated my activism, activated my intellectualism, getting to understand the world around me. Because I kind of realized at that point, apathy surrounded me. Like I wanted to inspire change in a way that any way I could, really, with whatever tools I had. And obviously social media, is free. So I started there. I basically vowed at that point in time that I'd do everything that I could to hold police accountable. So in 2012, I started Police the Police, which is more or less an online organization, but it's been dedicated to documenting and archiving police brutality, misconduct, and abuse of authority. And shortly after that, the next year, 2013, my business partner and myself, Matt Agarist, started the Free Thought Project, and within a very brief period of time, we saw this explosion of growth because we're one of these like first waves of alternative media, and a lot of people weren't talking about the concepts that we were talking about, as you just mentioned. A lot of this stuff was counterintuitive. A lot of people weren't even really familiar with a lot of the conspiracy theories that are mainstream now. So, shortly after we started the Free Thought Project, we saw this huge explosion of growth. We saw this huge explosion of reach. And we were reaching millions of people a week, and sometimes upwards of like 30 to 40 million people a week. And I know it sounds a little crazy because they don't allow that now. Like social media has been so sanitized and homogenized that, you just really don't get that kind of reach anymore. But, we were reaching lots of people. We were bringing in lots of fans every week, and somewhere upwards of like 20 to 30 fans a week. So, we were really up there competing with some of these big mainstream media entities. And, I'll admit, Will, we weren't objective. We were unapologetically pro freedom, pro peace, pro accountability. And of course, that was enough to get us censored off of both Facebook and Twitter on the same day. We had our accounts removed, and we lost nearly 6 million fans in our whole network. So, after thousands of articles written, thousands of memes, in 2017, I think we even had nearly 1 billion video views. Our American dream was crushed. We basically made something out of nothing. And as you can imagine, it was pretty devastating. Once we were censored, we had to let go of our entire team overnight. I had just bought a house. I just found out I was having a kid. So we basically had the rug pulled out from under us after, 5 years of hard work. And we realized that the golden age of social media was over at that point. There was a lot of changes happening. There were the fact checkers coming in, a lot more censorship. So we kind of shifted gears into a different form of content creation with our podcast. And since then, we've had so many great guests, including yourself. We've had, Dr. Ron Paul, Dr. Robert Malone, Tom Woods, John McAfee, Ben Swan. I mean, even this past week, we had Adam Eisenberg, who is a 9/11 first responder who was at the Pentagon the day after 9/11 cleaning up the wreckage there. And, his recent podcast with us was explosive. He basically, says firsthand he didn't see any plane parts there. So I guess what I'm getting at is we have a very interesting podcast, and, definitely would recommend your listeners to check it out.
Yeah.
But, as much as things change, they stay the same. I'm still banned right now. In fact, I'm dealing with a shadow ban on Instagram. I'm still blocked on several, some of these legacy mainstream media social platforms. I'm still shadow banned. So I'm still chipping away, though. I haven't let them completely defeat me. And I actually just wrote a book. As you mentioned, you were kind enough to mention, we had the Know Your Rights book, but I also just personally wrote a book that was published 6 months ago called 3 Ways to Prepare for CBDCs. Yeah. And so far, it's been doing pretty well. It's an ebook. And you can find that at jasonbassler.com. But I'm happy to talk about any more of this stuff: police accountability, the Free Thought Project, social media censorship. It's one of my staples, or even the CBDC conversation.
Yeah, let's get into all of it, Jason. Okay, so a couple of years ago, I think like the kind of like the figurehead for a lot of like this world is Alex Jones. So Alex Jones was on Joe Rogan, and I hadn't listened to Alex Jones. Like, I just kind of knew of him. I had that unread library effect. Like, I never listened to Rush Limbaugh, but I knew I didn't like him. It was one of those things. It was, and I was like, you know what? Let me give it a shot. And in that, Joe was kind of holding him to account. He's like, really, look that up. Come on, Jamie, look that up. Pull it up. And a lot of the stuff that he was saying turned out to be true. And he was like on like the Epstein Island stuff, before it was cool and everything like that. Like what I said to my fellow teachers, and the people were saying like, oh my gosh, you listen to him, is I said, instead of censoring someone like Alex Jones or yourself, prove them wrong. Like, that's like the whole point of this as a teacher is, if I say something that's off or wrong or incorrect or unfactual or something like that, then just beat my argument. And, I was open about how I'm listening to this Alex Jones thing is really interesting. And a bunch of teachers at my school were like, I can't believe we're listening to that. I was like, I got a cool assignment for you to give your class. Have your students watch this podcast and then find sources to debunk all the things he's saying. Like, that can be done, or it can't. But this idea of censorship, it's like, you know, that's just not the way we get to the best ideas. If someone says, you know, Jason thinks that a plane didn't go into the Pentagon, well, then prove that it did. And it can't just be an appeal to authority, because we know, especially with what happened during COVID, you know, very like, you know, mainstream thinkers are like, I guess we shouldn't just listen to the people with a bunch of letters next to the game or name or have these positions. So other than that, like, what evidence do you have? And if the government has that evidence and not sharing it, then you call for more transparency from the government. I mean, this doesn't seem super complicated to me, but I guess I'm like a first principles thinker. I don't know. What are your thoughts on like that approach? And is that the approach that you kind of take? Like, are you open-minded enough that when someone says like you're wrong, that you're like, all right, well then tell me how I'm wrong, and you'll like shift your perspective and stuff like that?
Yeah, I guess you could say I'm crazy enough to even entertain flat Earth theories. You know, just
Yeah, me too. Now I
I,
am too.
I want to hear the evidence. I want to see the evidence. I want to hear the arguments. And before I could, dispel it completely or write it off as being crazy, let's hear the arguments. You know, I think I'm a firm believer of knowing your opponent's arguments so well that you could debunk it. And I
Yeah,
think
steel
that's
man.
important.
Yeah.
Sure. And I don't think there's enough of that. I think, especially within progressive circles, which I would assume there's some overlap with, the teachers unions and some of your colleagues and stuff.
Yeah, a
It
bit.
seems like it's more of a social club, right? Like, well, you can't actually listen to Alex Jones because you're going to be inculcated, right? Like you're going to have these crazy ideas all of a sudden inserted into your mind, and you're not going to be a rational enough thinker to actually debunk them yourself. And I think that's kind of the general sentiment there. So I'm right there with you, Will. Let's see the evidence, let's hear the arguments. And I feel like at this point in time, I'm well versed enough in understanding fallacies that if you do bring a fallacy to the table, well, it's going to be easy to dispel. It's going to be something easy to just cross off the list. And unfortunately, 9 times out of 10, people, will go for the emotional argument. They won't actually bring logic, reason, evidence to the table. And I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that they were just never taught how to be critical thinkers. So there's guilt by association when you're even talking about some of these people, which is absolutely absurd. And somebody like Alex Jones, who is a perpetual boogeyman. He's this guy who he's been lambasted by the media. In fact, he was one of the first people to be taken down across social media before us. And we saw that it was coming. We actually wrote an article. We said, hey, look, Alex Jones is first. We're going to be next. And we called it, and we were absolutely right. But they almost had to do that to a certain degree just to establish this credibility within the social platforms, the social media platforms. And unfortunately, fortunately for us, that's starting to erode now with, Elon Musk buying Twitter. And we're starting to see a little bit of like a neutralization happening across the board with different social media platforms. So Alex Jones, unfortunately, kind of had to be like the first guy through the door. He kind of had to take the hit for all of us. But I think in many ways, as you were saying, present that better argument. Don't just point at somebody and say, no, he's evil, he's wrong. Like, let's have that conversation. And if we can't, I think that's a great indicator that we don't have enough intellectual integrity in society. And that's something that we really need to focus on.
Yeah, critical thinking and civil discourse. I mean,
Sure.
I was talking to someone recently. They were talking about Marjorie Taylor Greene, just about how she's crazy and stuff like that. And I was like, do you know how many long form, like 90-minute interviews by a mainstream media source had been given to Marjorie Taylor Greene? They're like, I don't know. I was like, zero. 60 Minutes did not do a long thing where they ask her sincere questions ever. There was a Saturday Night Live sketch where it was like, and then here's our guest. They sit down with Marjorie Taylor Greene, and they're like asking her like questions, and she's being crazy. I was like, that would be great if that actually really happened. Like if I'm not saying Marjorie Taylor Greene isn't crazy, even maybe she is, maybe she's not. But the fact is that there's these narratives about people and not with people. Like, have the conversations with these people, but they're too dangerous because they question things. And that goes back to the education system, which is clearly a compliance model. It's an obedience model where you exchange curiosity for compliance. A kid who just asks a lot of questions gets in trouble. It's like, basically sit down and shut up and just regurgitate what I tell you. And that's just the whole system. So from K through 12 all the way up, if you ask a lot of questions, you're a troublemaker. And that's just not the way that we get to the best ideas, but it keeps people controlled. And I understand maybe it's like running the government, it's like running the biggest corporation ever. And you just have to keep people just compliant and controlled because, too much chaos will just break down the system. I don't want the whole system to break down. I mean, maybe you do because you're an anarchist, but I don't
Not
know.
a
It just,
collapsitarian though.
yeah, yeah.
I want a gradual evolution.
Yeah, what is that? So I've heard like Michael Malice talk about that. Let's go on that. Like the idea of being an anarchist. Like that sounds crazy. Like to like to like a lot of people listening. So like, what would you say is like the way that when you say like you have like leanings towards that when it comes to how to run society? What does that look like to you? Because it's kind of like I've had on like socialists or communists. I'm like, well, what does that look like to you? And then so they can kind of flush it out. And then how realistic is kind of your vision? Because you seem to know human
Sure.
beings pretty well. So.
Yeah, I'm definitely here to demystify the idea of anarchism. I definitely agree it has a negative connotation associated to it. So anytime people hear it, they're thinking of more of maybe the left wing school of thought anarchism, where they're throwing bricks through Starbucks windows and Molotov cocktails and all that stuff. That's definitely not where I'm coming from. I'm more aligned with the libertarian voluntarists, more of like the Rothbard school of thought, more of like the Ron Paul.
Ayn
He
Rand.
kind of some of the objectivism stuff, yeah. Although
Okay.
she, said herself she wasn't an anarchist. In fact, she was
Yeah.
entirely opposed to the idea
Oh,
and the
okay.
word itself. But where I'm coming from, there's three main tenets, three main principles for the school of thought, my flavor of libertarianism, if you will. That's non-aggression. So the non-aggression principle, which basically is, you don't have the right to initiate violence or force on other people unless it's in self-defense, regardless of the circumstances, and that's one way that we could just automatically write ourselves as anarchists, because something like the institution of government, the state, claims a legal monopoly to, initiate force for both funding itself through taxation,
Right.
extracting your funds and your production,
How
and
would that be
for
enforced?
enforcing it through violence. That was the other way I was going to
Right.
say it, which
Yeah.
is
So you would enforce it through like individuals protect themselves, like Second Amendment stuff. Like when you say like nonviolence, how would that be enforced on the people who are violent?
sure. So there's a bunch of different ways to look at that question. Of course, I mean, yeah, the individual, like self ownership, self autonomy, like you're, obviously the best person to defend yourself. You can call police and they're 11 minutes away.
Yeah.
But I think more realistically, what would actually happen is the market would step into place there, and there would be security and protection firms that would pop up that would be voluntarily funded. Because let's face it, like as much as I'm a two-way advocate, I love the idea of protecting myself with a firearm. That's not something I want to do all day, and that's not something that my neighbors are going to want to do all day as well. So the division of labor is a beautiful thing. I'd much rather hire professionals, people who actually know what they're doing, and let them do the job. And then, unlike what we have right now with law enforcement, we'd actually be able to withdraw our consent, withdraw our funds, voting with our lifestyle, if you
Yeah.
will, voting with our dollar. If this protection firm, let's say, was exceeding their mandate or exceeding the expectations that we had for them, or let's say they even just started acting more like police these days. They started pulling over your teenage son and roughing him up for no reason. Well, guess
Yeah.
what? You actually have the ability through the market apparatus to withdraw your money. You and your neighbors realize that this protection firm isn't the one that's going to work best for you, and you actually have an opportunity to withdraw those funds. And therefore, the protection firm itself, the security company, actually has incentive to provide a valuable experience to their patrons, to their customers, and that's the critical part that's missing right now within law enforcement. And I'd love to get into more of that too. In fact, I have a
Sure.
beautiful example of a man who is in Detroit by the name of Dale Brown, and he has a completely different way of approaching this. His approach is he wants to properly manage human threats to produce the most non-violent outcome possible, right? So one of the center's key principles is the promotion of non-violent conflict resolution. So instead of relying on some of the traditional law enforcement methods, Dale Brown emphasizes these de-escalation techniques and proactive measures to prevent violence altogether. So, right now, yeah, and it sounds like a no-brainer, right? But nobody's ever heard of this guy. So, right now, one of the biggest issues that we have is contempt of cop. It's one of the biggest crimes of America. If you're not giving cops their, what they believe is their due respect and for their authority, if you're not subservient enough, basically, 9 times out of 10, that's more of an offense to a cop than actually breaking the law. So what Dale Brown says at the Detroit the Threat Management Center is that, the key to protecting people is to put the protection of the individual and the families before your own, which is a complete 180 from what we have right now with law enforcement, right? Because they're trained to think, well, I got to get home to my family.
Right.
That's the paramount aspect of my career, my profession, right? But what Dale says is you can't truly protect people if your only concern is for your own safety. And the cornerstone of protection isn't guns, it's not laws, it's actually love for people, love for the community, love for actually protecting human beings. And I think that's just a huge departure from what we have right now with, this idea of militarized police who look at us like we're the enemy, and you got to also think like not everybody who gets shot by police and killed by police are just thugs and criminals who are breaking the law. In fact, a lot of these people are having mental health experiences. They're having some type of mental health issue. You're actually 16 times more likely to be killed by police if you're experiencing a mental health issue. So, Dale Brown says, guns are like a first aid kit. It's something that you should have, but it's not something you should depend upon. And what he teaches his staff is that they need to have this mental toolbox of de-escalation techniques, nonviolent options. And basically, when you have enough nonviolent options and de-escalation techniques, violence isn't really going to be an option. Like there's just so many other ways to handle the situation. So he is technically a private entity, a private institution doing this for the greater Detroit area. And he's focused on, what I was just saying, like the community oriented policing. And he also does like free training Friday for like domestic violence victims, stalking victims, stuff like that. So, and the last thing here I'll say is like, in 30 years, he always boasts about this as well. We had him on our podcast. In 30 years, he's hadn't had any clients or employees ever been killed or harmed. And obviously that's just a huge difference from, what we see in cities law enforcement now.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing with police because I have friends that are cops, trained jiu-jitsu with people that are cops. So my wife's, husbands are cops. And, like there are a lot of good police officers out there. There are like, it's kind of like, I think there's a lot of similarities between them and teachers. I think there's great teachers out there, but the system itself,
Indeed.
it's going to breed just things that they're just going to force you to become worse and worse and worse. Like it's like the system. It's probably like that with like politicians too. It's like you want to get into Washington to try and make change. Then you get in there and all the partisanship comes in and they just like someone like Tulsi Gabbard who tries to like push back. It's just like, they just get crushed. Like, I don't like the thing with cops is like, I was just at dinner on like a couple days ago with a friend of mine. He's a black dude who's married to a white girl, but like he was outside helping someone jump a car and this cop car pulled up and a dude got out. He was like a young guy, like early 20s, got out, gun pointed right at him, down on the ground. And he said like his voice, you could hear his voice. It was like high, it was squeaky. It was like, Jocko Willink has talked about that like when you can see this in all these videos, the kind of videos that you post on policing the police and stuff like that you've seen a million times, is when they're out of control, their voice raises like the octaves or whatever, like raise because they're terrified. And part of the reason they're terrified is because they are just ill-equipped. They're terrified because they're not trained. They don't do the stuff of like de-escalation drills. They don't do a lot of this stuff. They have less training requirements than, a lot of like barbers is what I've heard. I don't know.
Yeah.
Like,
oh, it's absolutely true. Yeah.
Like what are we doing? These are important jobs that again, these are the people that have a monopoly on violence. And yet they're going out there untrained. It just seems like common sense that it's a recipe for a disaster. And that's why we see it over and over and over again. And then it breeds this distrust and this weird tension between the citizens and the officer. I had an officer on,
absolutely,
Clarissa Phelan, who was on my podcast early on. And I said, when a cop pulls up behind me, and I'm a father of 3 and I'm driving an SUV and just like, a cop pulls up behind me, I don't go, whew, good, I'm safe now. A police officer's behind me. That's a problem. And I don't think most people do. It's not like I have a trunk full of trouble or anything like that. Like, why am I scared because they have this power to hit my pocketbook or use violence against me and stuff like that and really ruin my day? I mean, it's the way we do policing is so odd. And for you, it makes sense for you, who's like a critical thinker and a free thought person to just be like, could we do this better? What would that look like? Like, what would you say, other than with the things you mentioned, what are the biggest problems in policing, and then how do we solve them?
Sure. Well, I was going to mention you're not alone,
Yeah.
when you have an officer behind you and you feel that way. And, Will, I'm right there with you. I'm not a collectivist, so I'm not just here to paint with a broad brush stroke, like I understand there are good people in law enforcement. In fact, I have a few friends who are within law enforcement. I even have a few friends who are out of law enforcement now because they're whistleblowers. And
Wow.
they got pushed out, unfortunately. But
Yeah.
what I would mention is that there's actually been legal cases established that police don't actually have a legal obligation to protect us. So first and foremost, we kind of have to get past this idea that police are here to protect us, because ultimately they're not. They're here to enforce laws. And three different times, Warren versus DC. In 2005, there was a Supreme Court ruling, and then again in the Parkland shooting ruling. Each time it was designated that police don't actually have, an obligation to protect the people. So, what I think this ultimately comes down to is two different things: a lack of contracts, and and that goes in hand with a lack of incentive. And you were just kind of detailing there some of the overlap with law enforcement officers and teachers, government teachers. And I think both of those kind of suffer from the same affliction, which is just the incentive problem, because if you're going to be paid through involuntarily extracted tax dollars, regardless of your performance, regardless if you're efficient or effective, ever improve, or if you're ever accountable, you're not going to ever put any effort towards those things. And the idea that we're going to somehow magically reform this through government is delusional thinking. You can't cure cancer with a cancer. And 1886 was the Haymarket Massacre. That was one of the very first times,
Mhm.
which you probably know, you're a
Yeah.
history teacher. That was one of the very first times police accountability protests happened, because they were upset that police had killed people. That was 140 years ago, and we're still begging for incremental government reform on this topic. 2023, this past year, was actually the deadliest year for Americans on record. Police killed more people, more Americans last year than any year ever before on record. So the
Wow.
idea that these protests, with the George Floyd 2020 protests and everything, although it was a global phenomenon, it just doesn't work. So the problem again is, when government commits any type of wrongdoing, police commit any type of wrongdoing, who ends up paying for it? We do. They get a slap on the wrist. Sometimes, in fact, it's actually the opposite. Sometimes departments will get more funding. They'll end up getting more officers because one of their officers did something illegal and ended up costing the city, millions of dollars in settlements. So there's obviously a big problem here, and what my work has always been focused on is not necessarily just the protesting in the streets, but is just trying to get it in people's head that we need to evolve into a different frame of
Yeah.
mind to
Yeah.
fix this.
Yeah. I love that. The 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 issues with policing, like you say certain things that exist, like civil asset forfeiture, and then I saw like what was that? What's the guy on like HBO? He has like British accent. John Oliver did like,
Mhm.
he's like, I'm not a huge fan of his, but he did one that was on civil asset forfeiture that opened my eyes up. Like, oh my gosh, that
Sure.
happens. Like they can just take your stuff. That's it.
Yeah.
Like there, it's very strange how this exists, because people know that human beings, can't be trusted, and they're always trying to sneak things away from you and blah 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 blah. But the government's human beings. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? And then also
Exactly.
when you say, Jason, like who does their bad behavior negatively affect? It's us, but it's not evenly proportioned. It's certain people in society, and it's
Sure.
generally people without as many resources, poorer people, working class people, and stuff like that. Which again, so I'm gonna be on my side of all my woke peeps out there. Okay, is like people of color a lot of times, or people from the trailer park or something like that. Those are the ones that get the brunt of it, because I've
I
taught
don't
in the
deny that.
poor neighborhoods, I've taught in the rich neighborhoods. I taught in East LA, and a kid that right after he graduated, hit me up and he's like, Mr. Russo, I need you to write me a letter to the judge. I was like, what happened? It's like, my girlfriend broke up with me and I went to the liquor store and I grabbed 2 cases of beer and I just ran out. And the Korean grocer chased me down, tackled me, held me there. And I had a knife in my pocket. I didn't pull it on him or anything, but it fell out. Cop showed up. He's like, I'm facing something crazy. It was like 15 months or something like that. And I wrote a letter to say like, give this kid one shot. And what I said in the letter is like, if that would happen, now I'm teaching like Jason to Beverly Hills. I was like, if one kid in Beverly Hills did that, stole some beer and then just ran away and got like, he wouldn't serve any time in jail.
Absolutely.
Like there is a 2-tier system. Like we see that, and you can see that with poor people or just people that are quote unquote problematic. Could be Trump. Yeah, I defend Trump all the time. Never voted for the guy. Not a big fan of the guy, but I have to defend him all the time because I think it's very clearly like a 2-tier justice system. And I think that's the way policing works too. Like I look like this. So I used to drive a really crappy car, a Daewoo Lanos, and it was all dented up and really terrible. And I get pulled over and they'd walk up and they'd be like surprised to see like a clean cut white boy there. I'd be like, oh, okay. Okay. Hey, just, get home safe. It's really interesting. But if I had like my black friend in the car or something like that, it was not that. So it's not to like, but that's where I align. Like I'm known as like this anti-woke person, but at the same time, like I'm on your side. I'm like anti the war on drugs for a lot of reasons, but a big one is because of the racial disparities in the way that drug law is enforced.
Yeah, absolutely. That's more of your rational nuance there, Will.
Yeah.
You have a problem, man.
Like, oh, you're a white supremacist, anti blah 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 blah. It's like, no, nice try.
People just expect the black and white thinking, and again, that's one of the many reasons I was looking forward to this conversation today, is because I appreciate you're able to break some of this down. And speaking of civil asset forfeiture, you're completely right. That's something that is basically legalized robbery. I would go one step even further, though, and say that some of these, victimless crimes, some of these victimless traffic infractions, like what we just witnessed a few days ago with Dexter Reed, who I know you covered that story. I watched your video, and I think that you hit the nail on the head there. There's certainly it's problematic the way the media rolled this out, right? And especially some of the deceptive imagery that they used.
Yeah.
They used his like graduation photo and stuff. And so there is obviously this aspect that's happening through, the media with this divide and conquer, mechanisms trying to kind of pit us against each other. And they have no problems just kind of being hyperbolic and sensationalist and all this stuff, but I did want to get into that, if you don't mind, if we
Please.
could, talk about that whole incident. I didn't have a lot of time to really examine it, but I thought maybe we could talk about it because it was something that you just recently covered. But so if, obviously if the officers were shot at, that's something that completely aligns with my libertarian, philosophy and theory. It's like, if you are under fire, if you're under attack, you have every right to defend yourself, right? So what I'm wondering, though, is like, do we know for sure that he was the person who fired first? Like, has there been any type of like real, ballistic testing or anything that really could identify that he was the first person to fire first? Because we know, at least I know historically through my work over the past 10 years, that police lie like they breathe, and unfortunately, that's just a reality that we have to accept. And second of all, I know this gentleman, he kind of got smeared by the right as well because he had previous charges, one of which I found out was just a gun charge, and if it was just simply for possessing a gun, that's a victimless offense, so I don't think that's something, unless he was, I don't know, maybe you have more information on it, he was a violent offender or something, then maybe we could, cast a little more doubt on the situation and say that this individual maybe was unsavory and dangerous as well. But if he was just carrying a gun, well, the Second Amendment guarantees that, so we don't really we can't really know for sure. I didn't do enough research. Another problem here with this situation was that none of these officers were in uniform, right? Like there was like 4 of them in plain clothes and an undercover cop car, and they're rushing up to this guy with their guns drawn and approaching him for a traffic violation, because I believe he ran a stop sign or something like that.
Yeah, didn't have a seatbelt on. Yeah,
seatbelt.
Like that. I thought they had police like a vest on, but I might be wrong. Like, I don't know. All I did was I read the article other than just a headline, and it mentioned that stuff. So that's all that was going on.
Well, the angles that I saw was from a body camera, and I couldn't see if they did have. Sometimes they do have the vest, and it's like kind of minimal. But I feel like what I'm trying to get across here is that there's better ways to handle this. If it is going to be something that's super dangerous, like why have 4 or 5 different officers approach them and then do this shootout in the middle of a residential area in Chicago? Like there's
Yeah.
better ways, there's fines, there's infractions. You could even, visit his home or workplace with other law enforcement, and that might be a little less aggressive, a little less, putting him in a confrontational situation where he feels like his back up is against the wall. And I'm not trying to defend any type of criminals. Again, I don't know the guy's track record, but what I'm trying to say is there are other ways to handle these things. Not everything is how we see, on TV,
Right.
and I think a lot of people who chime in on these types of situations don't have any context for it. They just think, well, he was a bad guy. The cops did their job. Case closed.
Yeah. Or no matter what he did, he shouldn't have gotten killed by the cops, like the other
Sure,
side
right.
too.
Exactly.
I like the stories. I mean, I don't like them. They're horrifying actually, but like I use them. Philandro Castile is a good one because
Sure.
he was pulled over and he's like, officer, he's like, get your license. He's like, officer, I have a gun in the glove box. Just want to let you know. They're like, don't grab it. He's like, I won't. Don't grab it. He has a gun, and then shot him. And then the fact that the NRA didn't defend him was
Absolutely.
really gross. That's one. And then the other one that really breaks me up is Sandra Bland. You talk about like de-escalation. Sandra Bland was, just minding her own business, having a tough time, was smoking a cigarette. The officer told her to put it out. She's like, no, I'm in my car. I'm allowed to smoke a cigarette. And it was that thing that you mentioned. What was the phrasing you used? Like contempt of cop. Yeah. And that was so obvious. Like, how dare you not? And then they arrested this woman who's really just struggling in life, and you could tell, and he had no thought of like, this is a human being that's struggling with something. And then she ended up killing herself in a jail cell. And like, I mean, some people say that she was killed, but I think if she killed herself, it's almost worse. It's like what you drove this woman to this situation. There's so many examples like that where this violence of someone can be pushed to violence. Someone who just like doesn't have a lot to live for. They're just having just like a really down day. And if you can turn that around for them, that's the power that exists in these law enforcement officers. And they seem just ill-equipped to be able to handle it. They're just scared, like if a snake's in my house, it's curious if we think about this. So like if a snake's in my house and I don't know anything about snakes, I'm going to just stomp on it. But if I know a little bit about snakes, I've been around snakes a little bit, then I can say, that's a garter snake. It's all good. I can just pick it up and toss it outside. Even if it's a rattlesnake, then what I can do is get like a stick, and I know the distance in which they can strike and all this kind of stuff. I don't have to just out of fear, just destroy life and ruin things. I think that police officers go into these situations where they don't live in the communities that they're policing. They don't know the people. They don't know. It's not like that's Officer Johnson. Oh, how you doing, Bob? Good to see you. There's none of that anymore. And so they're going out there terrified, and they're just stomping on the snake when the snake could very easily just be thrown in a pillowcase and let outside.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. And, when you're trained to be a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yeah. And that's the way it seems like the way they're trained.
And not only that, they're trained to understand what their limitations are as far as legal repercussions. And it's more of viewing a situation in the legal context, like this is what I could get away with. Could be legally justified through my, police union, through my own lawyers if need be. And again, at the end of the day, they're not the ones who are paying out of pocket for these settlements. There has been a few of those situations, and we've covered them over the years on the Free Thought Project, where the judge actually orders the officer to pay out of pocket for the settlements. But it's very far and few between, and something that I think needs to happen a lot more. And of course, there's something like, the individual liability insurance, which I've made videos on before, which sounds like a good idea on its face. Let the insurance companies kind of take on the burden of hiring these officers. And if they have any previous dings on their track record, then, hey, look, there can't be a law enforcement officer, or their premium is, through the roof. Like they have to have some type of extra layer of coverage or something. But again, Will, like I suggest this. I suggest, ending qualified immunity, stuff like that. But I feel like this is just barely chipping away at the larger problem, which is the institution of law enforcement is funded by stolen money through taxation. So until that changes, nothing is ever going to really fundamentally change. And you can take that to the bank. I'm going to be saying this until my face turns blue and for the next 10 years. And because that's not the mainstream narrative, and we watched it throughout the George Floyd Black Lives Matter got put on a pedestal. And don't get me wrong, there's some aspects of Black Lives Matter and protesting and all the social justice stuff that I appreciate and I support. But I also feel like we need to dig deeper, and again, the Haymarket riot, it's like we've been doing this for 140 years. Like, do we need another 140 years? Like, asking and begging for some type of change? Or are we going to be serious about this and really try to build parallel institutions like Dale Brown and Detroit, who we can point to and say, look, this guy's actually doing it. This guy's actually working for his community. And it's been so perverted right now. It's, law enforcement's been turning into this racket, this revenue generation racket through victimless traffic infractions. And they're basically a gang of bullies in a lot of major inner cities and stuff, harassing people, stop and frisk, stuff like that. So we definitely need to evolve. It's time for a change.
I think so. And I think the internet's the way to do it. I mean, you mentioned Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street was pretty incredible. I mean, it really was. Now it like transformed into, like, it's like, that was like the early seeds of, I think, a lot of like kind of some really out there kind of goofy kind of woke movements and stuff like that. Cause it's just like anything in power is bad. Like, I don't know, but Occupy Wall Street seemed like it was a good start to just calling out corruption and then moving on. But like people are more like, my corruption's okay, but their corruption's wrong. As opposed to like getting on the same page. Liberals and conservatives, like that's the thing about being more libertarian is people, it's left and right. Like there's a lot of like alignment there, and because we're so divided, I tend to lean more toward libertarian ideas because I'm trying to be like a uniting force and trying to see like left and right. Here's where we can agree. It's kind of like the cylinder radio idea,
Sure.
Let's get into the central bank digital currency real quick. So like,
Sure, Bo.
the idea of like a digital currency, so like a Bitcoin or something like that. Here's my understanding, not knowing much, and you can educate me a little bit. Is like, the cool thing about it is it's not tied to the government, so it's just in the hands of the people who agree for this exchange. Something that people say is like the problem with like Bitcoin, they're like, it's not backed by anything, and then I have to be like, either is American dollars. It's just the way that I explain it. Well, the way I explain it in my class is this. I say something like, okay, this little phone case, okay, if you have this in your hand at the end of the year, you get straight A's no matter what. This now has value because we all agree that it has value. And if everyone agrees that something has value, then it has value. That's kind of the way that I kind of explain it. But I say that a central bank digital currency defeats the purpose of why we would have digital currency in the beginning, which is to get away from the people who are controlling this, like the Federal Reserve and stuff like that. And what we saw already with like the Canadian truckers and stuff like that is if there's a central bank digital currency that they can say you can't buy X, Y, and Z with that, they can shut down your purchasing power. Where if you have paper dollars, cash is always king. You can always go and buy. You can buy your prostitutes and your cocaine, or you can go buy a Lamborghini if you have enough of it. Like you can buy whatever you want with cash. And when it gets all digital, what's stopping them from just turning it into zeros? Really? Like what's stopping them? Or they don't agree with your purchases, so you can't purchase it now. And we've seen seeds of that. Is that the biggest danger for central bank digital currency? And how far off am I on my kind of explanation?
No, you're spot on, man. For somebody who says he's not really familiar with it, absolutely, you're spot on. That is one of the biggest threats. I would say that, along with being coupled with like a digital ID, a social credit score, which we're already seeing being rolled out in China, which I know sounds like science fiction, but there are already some seedlings kind of being planted for that. And then the ultimate kind of way of wrapping it up is these 15-minute cities, which has been popularized by like the World Economic Forum and smart
Can you explain
cities.
what that means? So the other one, what's the first thing you mentioned? Social currency is like
Social
you
credit
help
score.
an old lady across the street and you get like points or something like that, and you knock an old lady over, you don't, and you're surveilled constantly. There's like a barcode and stuff like that. And then if you want to get like a passport or something, it's gonna be harder if you knocked over the little old lady. Like there's these moral police, essentially these moral police saying like these are the morals that you live by, and having everyone like adhere to that. But what is the
Yeah, the social credit scores. Well, I mean, our lives these days, they're so embedded with the digital realm that it really isn't hard to track our movements, our
Right.
transactions, all these things. And especially if you go to a place like China, where it's very dystopian and
Right.
Orwellian, and there's cameras everywhere. So you hit the nail on the head again, Will. Basically, if you do something that the government deems that could be bad for your health, even you could get
Yeah.
dinged for a few points. If you accidentally litter something, a piece of something, trash falls out of your pocket,
It's
you
so
could.
counter to what America was founded. It's so counter to what the Constitution, Declaration of Independence is all about. It's the exact
Right.
opposite.
Sure. No, absolutely. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to be heading in that direction more and more. And unfortunately, there's like this public private kind of entity that's growing too, where we've seen this already with like climate change, where uh, corporations push for things such as like ESG, right?
Yeah.
And so, firms like BlackRock, Vanguard, even Amazon, they're advocating for it, which is, the environmental, social, and governance, which is basically just this criteria for corporations. They're rolling this out, basically saying to private companies, like, hey, if you want our money, you have to show us your ESG score. Like, how many women do you have on your board, for
Yeah.
instance, or how many minorities have you hired or whatever. So it's basically this trickle down process to bring things in through the back door. And it's just another step towards fascism, with corporate capture and the revolving door with industry. So more cronyism, more corporatism. And, and unfortunately, it does very much feel like things are heading that way. Right now, 131 different countries are piloting or have already implemented CBDCs. So 131 countries, including major economies like Japan and Russia, and so even
And
in
paper
California,
money. So they have the digital currency and paper money.
correct? Yeah,
What's
for
and
right
but they
now.
just incentivize
Well,
you to get the digital currency.
yeah, exactly. But it's funny you mentioned that in the very beginning when you're talking about this, that the CBDC basically doesn't have any added value or benefit. Someplace like Nigeria, who's actually on its like fourth trial now with CBDCs, it's been rejected each and every time because they keep rolling it out with these new like parameters to try to like lure people in. But the people there have already grown accustomed to using Bitcoin, and they don't find any value by signing up for this new CBDC, this government CBDC, the Enera it's called. So they've even rioted in the streets. They burnt down banks because of it. So this has been something that's been launched in different countries. I think 12 different, 11 or 12 different countries that are fully on the CBDC. They're all kind of smaller economies, but I was going to say even California right now is piloting digital IDs. Over the holidays, that was like this big thing. If you're going to the airports, like it's called the MDL. It's like your
It's
mobile
on your
driver's
phone.
license. Yeah, on your
A friend of
phone.
mine
So
was
I
just
mean,
showing me that. He's like, check it out. My driver's license is on my phone. And I just like, I don't even carry a wallet anymore. It's
right. And I
convenience.
think obviously it sounds convenient. It
Yeah.
sounds great, but that's the way they always lure us into these things. They say, well, we're just trying to be inclusive. We're just trying to provide convenience for your life. Of course, they never cared about being inclusive and, with the banking industry for two,
Yeah.
two different centuries. But now all of a sudden when CBDCs come around, they're trying to sell it to us, So the G20 just last September in New Delhi agreed to eventually impose digital currencies and digital IDs. And obviously the G20 is like this big, powerful group of world leaders. So to me, it feels like it's more of a threat than like, Putin or these right-wing extremists or national security leagues or any of these other things that, the government and the media try to focus on. And some might even say that this is the next evolution of warfare too.
Yeah.
So
Just when you say they, what I've kind of gotten to with this is it's people who have a lot of power. So it could be a lot of wealth, it could be a lot of political power, whatever it is, who, and maybe I'm giving them too much credit, but I think that they truly believe that their way will be good for society. So they want to implement it everywhere. So I don't know if it's like guys twisting their mustache like or Claw from Inspector Gadget who's just petting the cat, like evil people who want to do evil things. I think that they are powerful people who want to have control. They're used to controlling their corporations or controlling their city or whatever it is. So they just want to grow that control and work with people. I don't want to assign them like ill intent. I think that it's maybe good intended, and just because of their situation, because they're just surrounded by yes men and they have so much power to anyone who pushes back and stuff like that, that don't take my power away from me, from taking my company all the way up to working at the World Economic Forum or whatever it is, that it's just these people that go, I have a lot of employees and they're happy. So if I have essentially all of society, they'll be happy. That's the concept of like, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy, is like, I got you digital currencies. I keep you safe. I do that, blah, 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 blah. All you got to do is obey me. That's it. All you got to do is obey me, and then you'll be safe and you'll be good. Just like say thank you and move on. That's the way I think that they see the world. I don't think they're evil people. I think that they're just, they believe that they are the ones, like the social gospel thing, like the social Darwinism of like, they're just at the top, and so they should be in charge because they can handle it or something like that. I don't know if that's giving them too much charity though.
No, I don't. I don't. Well, yeah, there's a lot there. There's a lot to unpack for sure. I think there is probably a strategy, and they have a investment to try to perceive and show themselves under that kind of light.
Is that who when you say they, is that who you mean too? Like, are we on the same page with that?
Sure. Well,
Okay.
I think it could be any number of the ruling class or elites, because I don't think they're all under this malicious, like we have to have like one world government and we're all pushing for globalism. But I do think there is an element of that. And I think there could be nefarious actors. And I do think that does exist. I've had enough podcast guests on who detail it, down to the very specifics about how there is eugenics being played out on a larger scale, how there is like world government being orchestrated behind the scenes. And you also got to remember like things like Operation Mockingbird, like these have been
Real
instituted, orchestrated. This whole movement, has been over the past, I don't know, since World War II to establish the US dominance. And not only that, but just to kind of create this one world government behind the scenes. I don't think that's crazy to say, unfortunately. I know it does sound a little wacky, but then on the flip side, I'm right there with you. I think there's a lot of people who just really want to hold on and cling to their power. They have self-interest kind of incentives and motivations. So I think it's kind of a mixture of both. Unfortunately, there are so many Washington think tanks out there, so many World Economic Forums. They get together at these Bilderberg meetings, stuff like that. I mean, it's not uncommon. In fact, it's becoming more and more exposed, by the year with social media. So the idea that nobody is really planning some type of way to control the larger economies in this world, or control everything down to our own perceptions of reality, I think would be a bit naive to say it's not happening, because there's just so much evidence that it is. But is there one, formulated plan by one, top entity that we all refer to as they? I think that's what some people want to think is the case, but I do think it is kind of a decentralized, if you will, centralized network of people at the top who have incentives to, cling on to power and control any way that they can.
Yeah, Jason, I could talk to you we've already done like an hour. Like I could talk to you forever because there's so many like specific things, like talk about 9/11. And so like to put it simply, like you don't believe the mainstream narrative about 9/11 attacks. Put it that way, right?
Yeah, definitely
Okay.
not.
Okay,
Definitely
right.
not.
Okay. So what the thing that I would urge people to do with people like yourself, and I think there's a lot of people that probably share that like umbrella kind of phrasing and don't have their ducks in a row, but that doesn't mean that there isn't something very real to what you're saying. You do have your ducks in a row. Like there's a difference. Just because like it's like you go around, you interview these people who are at Trump rallies who are idiots and can't put two and two together. It's like, yeah, they exist, but also there's, Ben Shapiro who's going to vote for Trump, who's obviously quite astute. So like we're all over the place here. You can't just say like this is what you have to do is you get curious. You find the best people. If someone says like anyone who thinks that 9/11 was an inside job, or that Tower 7 just, that it didn't come down, by because of the heat or whatever, anyone that thinks like that is just crazy. What I would do is urge them to find the best representatives that disagree with you. And then what you can have is an elevated conversation, because a conversation between you and someone who only watched CNN one time and only read what's in a history textbook about 9/11 wouldn't be that interesting. But someone who did research and a lot of research, hours of research, and landed in a different place than you would be very interesting. And I think that's where we need to get to more and more and more as a society, is we hold up the best representatives from different perspectives and have like a cordial conversation, like a conversation where you can both kind of learn from each other and share, like, do you know about this report about this? No, I don't. Well, here, let me send it to you. I'll send you the PDFs. Okay, do you know about this one? No, I didn't hear about that person. Let me send you the interview. Like, we could get really close to the truth. But instead, what happens is you get labeled like a crazy conspiracy theorist, okay? And then they get labeled, you know, just like a mainstream sheep or something like that. And then what we don't have is that kind of civil discourse. I think that's really, really important for working our way through this. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And in
Okay.
fact, that's something I've been saying for years now, is the
Yeah.
intellectual integrity. We need
Yeah.
to focus on our own personal intellectual integrity so we can absorb different ideas without having a knee-jerk reaction, without our own confirmation bias, trying to pump out our own opinions to an echo chamber just so we feel validated, or we're in our in-group preferences with our own tribes.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's not getting us anywhere. We need more nuance. We need more logic. We need more reason. We need more evidence. And I've been one to say for a while now, I understand I'm not the smartest person. I'm not the most articulate. That's why I have the people who come onto my podcast who are the people who are actually changing the world, the people who understand these topics much better than myself. And I'm doing what I can to at least expose these people to a larger audience, because, again, I know what I don't know. And I think we have to have a little humility here, right? You
I love
also
it.
have to, yeah, why not just admit it? I think that's the most powerful thing you could do. Those, 3 words: I don't know. I don't know.
Get curious. I say intellectual humility, genuine curiosity, and grace. And if you apply those three, we'll get really far. Who do you think, the last question I have for you is, who do you think is like gonna be if it's like they, who is the biggest threat? If we're like in this rebel alliance, Jason, we're trying to like get more transparency of the government, trying to like keep the hierarchy, the socioeconomic hierarchy, the best and the brightest at the top, not just the most well-connected and stuff like that. Is it Elon Musk? Is it Joe Rogan with his platform? Is it RFK Jr.? I mean, who do you see as like the people who can actually bring about these changes, that like you're trying to make these changes, but your platform, for for the things you mentioned in the beginning, is stunted. There are people who have massive platforms who are kind of aligned with what you're talking about, what I'm trying to do in the classroom to some degree, of just like bringing some of this stuff. Who do you see as like the biggest threats to kind of the status quo that we're in now, whether from policing all the way up and down?
Well, Will, I have a little bit of a cliche answer for you, but I'm going to say I'm going to say it's your own individual mind, your own action, your own behaviors, the way that you spend your dollars, the way that you vote with your lifestyle. All these things are absolutely important.
Don't
And
count
yes, there
on
are
don't count on Elon Musk to save us. You got to go out and save yourself.
false idols,
Yeah.
and that
Yeah.
can
I
very
like
much be
that.
propagated by the same people who are orchestrating the reality around us. So who knows if Elon Musk is even an authentic,
Right.
legitimate actor? Unfortunately, I want to believe he is. He put out the Twitter files. That's wonderful. That gave us a backdoor into everything that the Twitter community and government had been colluding on for years now. But there's also a lot of shady stuff about Elon Musk.
Yeah.
If you dig into his history, you dig into his connections, you dig into his family relations. So I'm right here to say that it's you. It's your person, your own personhood. You own yourself. Act like it. Do what's right. Invest into yourself. Invest in your mind. Learn things. Ask questions. And that's the only way we're going to get through this. So, but if you want the non-cliche answer, I would say Javier Milei, the new
Yeah.
president of Argentina. He's an anarcho-capitalist. That's the school of thought that I ascribe to, and he's very well read. In fact, before he came onto the scene, the media wouldn't utter the words anarcho-capitalism. If you gave them $1 million, that would
Yeah.
seem like it was something that they were trying to stay far away from. I mean, it was toxic, it was taboo. Now they're talking about it. Now we're hearing more conversations about it. So if anybody, I think he might have the Ron Paul effect, where he does inspire generations of new thinkers, critical thinkers, and people who are interested in economics and philosophy and all that stuff. So, fingers crossed. But at the same time, I'm not here to prop up anybody, put them on a pedestal. There already has done a few things already that might be a little questionable to some people. So, that's exactly why I gave you the first answer, because we can't count on anybody.
I like. I mean, I have good friends in Argentina. Shout out to Val and Pablo, and they voted for him, and they were like really excited because like, look, we know what the other direction is going to get us, so let's take a flyer. So it actually connects with your better answer, which is it's on you, because they, were kind of they were just kind of really apathetic when it came to elections in Argentina, and now they got excited. They got excited. They
Sure.
got civically engaged. And I think
Exactly.
at the very least that these people, it could be like a Joe Rogan or something. Like he inspires people. It's not that he's going to save us; it's that he's going to inspire people to start asking questions more. Like, oh, the guy with this guy who looks like a thumb with two thumbs, who's an MMA commentator. Has the biggest media platform. Why? Exactly. Because he's curious and he's asking questions, and
Exactly.
he gives people platforms who aren't given platforms and stuff like that. And the free market's stepping in and saying, oh, here's $250 million. That is inspiring to young people who can follow exactly what you said, which is like, oh, there's a thirst here for what's going on. And then I'm going to start asking questions too. Making it cool to ask questions and to push back on authority seems like a good direction to go in. So I love that. So, Jason, thank you so much. We over an hour already. I could just keep going and going and going. Tell us where to find your stuff. So, obviously, Jason Bassler on it will be in the show notes with your website that has everything. But where else can people
Thank you, brother.
find you, and what are you up to?
Yeah, absolutely, man. Well, the freethoughtproject.com is kind of the hub for everything. At the top there, you'll see a tab for our podcast. So definitely check that out, guys. Otherwise, as I said, we've been censored into oblivion. So I'm literally on every social media platform, probably several you've never even heard of before. But I'll just give you kind of the more of the mainstream ones. Twitter, Jason Bassler 1. On Instagram, I'm jason.e.bassler. And then also Bassler.com is where you could check out my book, 3 Ways to Prepare for CBDCs. And just really quick on that, guys, as we were just talking about, this isn't something that, is speculative. It's not something that, might happen. The train has already left the station on this. So now is the time to prepare, not when shit hits the fan or there's some type of crisis or, Bitcoin and decentralized, the cryptocurrencies go through the roof. Like right now is the time to be learning how we can prepare for ourselves, and just buying crypto and being kind of savvy within that world is just one of the things that we need to do to kind of be ahead of the curve on this. But otherwise, yeah, check out our Know Your Rights book as well, that Will was so kind to mention. That's also at jasonbassler.com or littlefreethinkers.com. But I won't overwhelm your audience. I'll just stop there. So thanks
It'll
for
all
your
be in the
time
show
today.
notes on YouTube. Yeah, Jason,
Thank you,
thank you so
brother.
much, man. This is really interesting for a curious person like me who lived a long time just being closed-minded and just went with like whatever the narrative was. It's your platform, the way that you address things, even when things that I might disagree with, I'm like, it sparks thought, which is Socrates said.
Sure.
I can't teach anybody anything. I just spark thought, and I get my head scratchers all the time. Interacting with the stuff that you do. So I couldn't recommend it more. Thank you so much for giving me your time and coming on here, man.
Thank you, brother.